Torino, and I have the honor to chair this session. In this session, we will talk about the challenges for the hydrogen penetration in the European future energy scenario, the possible pathways of this technology, its role to achieve the net zero in 2050. I think this is a very important and cutting-edge topic, and to help us to understand it better, we will have four experts in the field speakers. Elisabeth Zeyen from Technical University of Berlin, Adrian Odenwälder from Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, Pedro Crespo del Granado from the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, Falco Uker from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. Each speaker will have 15 minutes for the presentation. After each presentation, there will be space for questions. So please feel free to write the question on the chat. But if you have the possibility, I think it's even better if you can just turn on the microphone and ask directly the question to the speaker. So I just want to thank you, all of you, to participate in this session, and thank you, of course, to all the speakers. I don't want to take any more time, so I will just introduce the first speaker, Elisabeth Zeyen. Elisabeth Zeyen is a PhD student at the Technical University of Berlin. She has a background in physics. Her research focus is sector coupling and decarbonization pathways in a European energy system. So she will present us her research entitled Endogenous Learning for Green Hydrogen in a Sector-Coupled Energy Model for Europe. So Elisabeth, I will tell you when you will have 2 minutes left for your presentation, and the floor is yours.
All right, thanks a lot for the nice introduction. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Great. So thanks a lot for organizing this conference. Today I would like to present to you some of our recent work, which we've done together with Marta Victoria, who is professor at Aarhus University, and my supervisor, Tom Brown, where we looked on the costs of green hydrogen production within Europe. So the EU has set certain targets to get to a climate neutral energy system by 2050. If we are looking at today's system, we still emit about 3.8 gigatons of CO2 every year. And we have like really small electrolysis capacities of about 130 megawatt. And the EU agreed to reduce the CO2 emission by 55% until 2030. And in the new Repower EU plan, they are targeting for 140 gigawatts of electrolyzers within Europe and 140 gigawatts of electrolyzers in neighboring countries. For 2040, there isn't like a set target, but Germany targets to build 10 gigawatts of electrolyzers, even though that was released before the Repower EU plan, so they might have to scale this up. So all those targets, basically, they raise the questions, which technologies should be supported, at which point in time, how are the investment costs going to develop, especially of new technologies, and where are we going to use hydrogen? One famous example about like decreasing investment costs is solar PV. These two graphics aren't from me, they're from Rupert Way and a recent publication which was published in Joule a few days ago. And what you can see in the left graphic as the black dots are basically the historical observed average costs for PV. And what you can see as the colorful lines is what was assumed in integrated assessment models. And you can see that most models overestimated the cost development of solar PV. And it's a very similar picture if you look in the right graphic, where we can see the assumed floor costs, which is basically like the minimum cost assumed for solar. And there, Like if you look at most of the lines, they were assuming higher floor costs than investment costs, which we have today for solar PV. And it's something similar for hydrogen electrolyzers, which is a new technology where we expect like a large employment in the upcoming years, which raises the question which costs, how the costs are going to develop. So what we wanted to look at in our publication is, on the one hand, what are the possible cost developments of green hydrogen production in Europe, but also how do different methods to model cost reduction influence our results. We didn't assume any build-out rates for renewables because these very often predetermine the results. And we also looked on the uncertainty of the learning rate by varying that. And we considered multiple sectors. So we looked at transport, industry, heating, and electricity, what is very important in the context of where the hydrogen is going to be used. And we assumed different CO2 budgets. This slide should give you a quick overview of how hydrogen is used and modeled in our model PIPESA EORSEC. So on the left side, you can see the different production ways. We do assume the production of gray hydrogen via steam methane reforming, blue hydrogen, where the carbon can be captured. We assume a capture rate of 90%, and green hydrogen via electrolysis. The hydrogen either can be methanized again, and then the methane can be used in different sectors within the model again. But it also can be used in the transport sector, in the heating sector, for example, for hydrogen boilers. We also allow that existing gas boilers can be retrofitted to run with hydrogen. And the electricity sector for fuel cells, or also, again, that existing gas turbines can be retrofitted to run with hydrogen, and in the industry sector. Like for most of the sectors, it's fully endogenized, so there isn't a fixed demand how much hydrogen is going to be used in hydrogen boilers, but they compete with other technologies. So if I satisfy the heating demand either with a heating pump, a resistive heater, a gas boiler, or a hydrogen boiler, and also how the hydrogen is going to be produced as part of the optimization. So if we produce gray, green, or blue hydrogen. Only for the transport sector, we basically have a fixed exogenous demand about how large is the share of electric vehicles going to be in 2030. We looked at 3 different methods how to model possible cost developments. The first one is like the and what we call the endogenous cost reduction. So we assumed a learning rate, which you can see here as a blue line. And we basically implemented this learning curve as a piecewise linearization, which you can see with the green stars here. And we assumed a time delayed learning, which means that the cost reductions in one investment period depend on what is installed in the previous investment periods. And we checked the robustness of the results by varying the learning rate by plus minus 10%. That's what you can see as the blue contour area.
Of course.
The second method is called sequential method in the following, where we start with exogenous cost assumptions, which we get from the Danish Energy Agency. We run our optimization problem. Then, depending on how much capacity is installed in this optimal solution, we update our investment costs, and then we rerun the optimization. The advantage of this method is that it still stays like a linear problem, so it's much easier to solve. The disadvantage is that basically the optimization doesn't have the foresight how much the costs actually can decrease. And in the third method, we basically assumed fixed cost assumptions depending on the build year of the asset that's what is done in most energy system models, and that's also what we were doing in previous studies. The sequential method is like the method 2 is one which is very often used in integrated assessment models. Coming to our assumptions, so we modeled the horizon from 2020 until 2050 with 7 investment periods. We assumed we assumed cost decrease for electrolyzers, where we assumed local learning, which means that the cost decrease of the hydrogen electrolyzers only depends on how much capacity we would build within Europe. For the renewables, for offshore wind, onshore wind, and solar, we assumed global learning. So basically, we looked what is the share of, for example, solar PV in Europe compared to worldwide, and we assumed that whatever is built in Europe would grow also worldwide in the same ratio. We used the sector-coupled model PIPES-A or SEC. We had like the renewable generation spatially resolved in 6 regions, but we reduced the transmission networks to one single node, and we run the problem with 10 typical days per year using the TSUM package. And the objective in the model is to minimize the total system costs. We assumed 3 different climate targets corresponding to our global warming of plus 1.5, plus 1.7, or plus 2 degrees. And we've done a sensitivity check where we varied the learning rate by plus minus 10%. So for example, if we have a learning rate for solar PV of 20%, we would vary it between 10 and 30%. Coming to the results, if we first look on the investment costs for electrolyzers for the tight budget of plus 1.5%, what you can see in the upper left graphic is the investment costs for the different years. As the gray line, these are the exogenous cost assumptions from the Danish Energy Agency. And as the green line, you can see the result from our endogenous optimization of the investment costs. By 2050, we arrive at very low costs of green hydrogen production of €1.26 per kilo of hydrogen. And what you can see as the green contour area is basically our sensitivity check where we varied the learning rate. If we look at the results from the sequential cost method, where we basically update the investment costs in an iterative process, you can see as an orange line that also there the investment costs are much lower than what we normally assume in the exogenous case, but are still higher than what we get with the endogenous method. We have done the same for the 2 other budgets. Overall, for all scenarios, we see like a strong decrease of the investment costs, which for most cases are below our exogenous assumptions from the Danish Energy Agency, and a very fast scale up of electrolysis capacities. The hydrogen production switches from gray to green hydrogen and doesn't use the option of blue hydrogen. We have done a sensitivity check where we basically had endogenous learning on blue hydrogen production and no learning on renewables and green hydrogen production, but still the option wasn't used. And hydrogen is used to produce oil products for industry and the transport sector, but it's not used in the heating sector, even though we have the option to retrofit existing gas boilers to run with hydrogen. When we look at the plus 2 degree budget, we can also see that there basically the sequential method doesn't have the foresight that the costs can decrease. And basically the investment costs stay, which you can see as an orange line, always over our exogenous assumptions from the Danish Energy Agency. If we look at the capacities which are installed for the electrolyzers, we can see that with the plus 1.7 budget, we see about 60 gigawatts of electrolyzers by 2030. While in RePower EU, currently 140 gigawatts are planned, but for the plus 1.5 budget, we see as cost optimal about 430 gigawatts of electrolyzers, which is clearly not realistic, giving like the necessary ramp up. If we again look on the difference between the three methods, for the plus 1.5 scenario, okay, I should rush. Then you can basically see that the exogenous method and the sequential method underestimate the employment of the CO2 of the electrolyzers. Okay, I will just skip that. And coming to the conclusion that we have enough time for that. So we had endogenous cost reductions through experience curves for multiple technologies in a sector-coupled European model, and that's important to consider all the sectors if you want to look where the hydrogen is really going to be used. And we also didn't constrain the renewable build-out rates, what is done in many other studies, but what basically predetermines very often the results. What we could see is that very low cost of hydrogen production are possible of €1.26 in 2050. These are achievable if early investments in hydrogen electrolyzers are being made. The hydrogen production switches from gray to green hydrogen, omitting the option of blue hydrogen. The total system costs are higher if investment costs aren't modeled endogenously, and they are overestimated by up to 13%. And this is even more pronounced if you look at the levelized costs of hydrogen, which are about 67% higher with the exogenous cost assumptions. Furthermore, investments in new technologies are delayed if cost decreases are not modeled endogenously. And that's because basically with exogenous cost assumptions, the model can wait until the investment costs are decreasing, and then the model would start investing into the new technology, while in reality, you first would have to invest into the new technology to drive down the investment costs. Thanks a lot for your attention. We have a preprint out, which you can scan with the QR code or also check out the link.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for your interesting presentation. I think it's very interesting, this idea of comparing different cost evaluation, this method for evaluation of the cost. So I have a question for you. If you can come back to slide 10, maybe it was 10. The previous one. Okay, yes, from this slide, I can see that the investment costs that are the result from the endogenous method resulted to be always the lowest. And from my understanding, this method is like the more precise compared to the other two. So I was expected that sometimes it will be the other method will be less precise. So sometimes they should overestimate the cost, but sometimes the other two methods should be underestimate the cost. But from this result, seems that the less precise method always overestimate the real cost of the technologies. So I would like to ask you if this is why this happened, if the normal way, the more simplified cost normally overestimate the real cost, or if something that can happen.
Yes, so basically the exogenous costs, which you can see as a gray line here, they are also based on some assumptions how how much the technology is going to be used. And you're right, in general, it could happen if you use the endogenous method, that also our investment costs are above the exogenous cost assumptions. Just what we see in our model is that there's a lot of hydrogen electrolyzers being deployed, and therefore the costs are decreasing stronger than what is expected from the Danish Energy Agency. And that basically emphasizes the need that as soon as you model an energy system, you want to connect the use of the technology with the investment costs.
Okay, thank you. I see that we have some questions from the chat, so I will pick the first one. They ask why different carbon budget scenarios give different cost pathways. Could you let us know more about these mechanisms?
Yeah, sure. So we assumed 3 different climate targets or carbon budgets, and basically the tighter budget is, the larger the need is to transform the energy system quickly. And with the very tight budget of plus 1.5 degree, we have to deploy more hydrogen electrolyzers, and that drives down the costs stronger and also earlier.
Okay. There is another question. In the 2030 1.5 degrees scenario, as a realistic scale up, as you said,
yeah.
How could you change your model to make it more realistic? Could you think of something else than hard constraints?
Something else than what kind of constraints? I didn't get the last part.
That was me. I can just jump in.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering. So yeah, I mean, if you say that is unrealistic, so what could you do about it essentially? So is the only thing you can do in your model to plug in a constraint and say, well, more than this is not possible, or can you think of anything else?
I mean, that's one of the things we've done, like as a sensitivity analysis, where we basically limited the build-out rates. And you could do this in general. We haven't done it, but in general, you could do this dependent on how much was built in the previous investment period, so that you don't have like just a fixed constraint. This is possible to build out on an annual basis. So that would be one option. We haven't done this in this case because there are like many studies where the build-out rates are constrained, and basically first they predetermine the results by constraining the build-out rates. You can really see that basically the build-out of, for example, the renewables is just along the constraint, and also that you put your own perception of what is possible previously into the model, and we didn't want to do that.
Yeah, I take over. It also leads to my question. It's really a hard thing to do, but not constraining scalability then predetermines your model results as well. Like if you have a cost optimal model and you put in a very tight budget and you know that hydrogen is indispensable, you have an immediate ramp up connected with an immediate cost decrease, which is also then the direct and intuitive result of the model setup. I mean, we run an integrated assessment model. We are on the progressive side, by the way, when it comes to future cost estimates. We include adjustment costs such that the model can choose if it really needs something. It just needs to pay more. It's again, you have to calibrate this, and there's no data for this. I mean, it leads to Adrian's presentation. What is a realistic scale up? We cannot tell. We can just say that what you have in the model, and even already the EU target is unprecedented. But I mean, including this as a hard constraint would then change your results. Of course, it would also change the result with respect to the cost decrease. And here I really wonder if there's empirical literature, if you really force a hydrogen economy manufacturing capacity to be built now with you would need subsidies, you would need an Inflation Reduction Act or something. Do we really see this learning? So this would be maybe my one question. Obviously, because you cannot jump over innovation cycles, and if you not really cycle but build all the manufacturing capacities at once because suddenly there's a secure demand via subsidies, is that really the learning that we saw in the past? Would that really have the same learning rate or a lower one?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have a concrete answer to that. What I can say is that on the one hand, we were a bit more restrictive by assuming like a temporal delayed learning. So we didn't assume that you get like the cost reduction immediately, but with a certain temporal delay. And that we varied the learning rate to do some sensitivity there. So for sure, there's like a high uncertainty of the learning rate of electrolyzers. And we tried to cover as many cases as possible by varying the learning rate by plus minus 10%. And what we can see in our results is that really very important for how much capacity is built at the end is the assumed climate target, and not just the investment costs. So for staying within the plus 1.5 budget, you just need a lot of electrolyzers.
Yeah, I'm sorry that I have to interrupt this interesting discussion, but we have to move on with the new speaker because we have a strict schedule. So thank you, Elizabeth, again. And the new speaker is Adrian Odenwälder. He has a PhD. He is a PhD student at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. His research areas include green hydrogen and renewable electricity and power system model. He's going to present us his research entitled Probabilistic Feasibility Space of Scaling Up Green Hydrogen Supply. So please, Adrian, you can start your presentation.
Yeah, thanks. I hope you can already see it and hear me, because I can't see. Okay, great. Yes, so thanks a lot for the introduction and for already reading out the title. I'm not going to read it out again, but essentially it boils down to the question: when will we be able to get green hydrogen at scale? So how long will it take until we can procure substantial amounts of green hydrogen supply? And this is now also work that we've recently done, but we've also recently published it just a few weeks ago in Nature Energy, which I'm really happy about. And yeah, check it out. Have a look at the paper if you're interested, and get in touch. And funnily enough, I'm just realizing how very close the corporate identity colors of ours and Nature Energy are. I'll take that as a good sign. And I'll jump right into what we looked at, and that is electrolysis projects over time. So both looking back into a project database, and then secondly also looking into the future and creating scenarios of future electrolysis scale up which is needed in order to produce green hydrogen. So this is not only for the EU, this is data from the IEA Hydrogen Projects database from October last year, I should say. So unfortunately, I wasn't able to update it. The IEA hasn't updated their data again, but they should do that in the upcoming few weeks. And yeah, I'll rerun our analysis then and post that on Twitter probably, so stay tuned if you're interested. However, all these caveats being said, what we still see is that there's a lot of electrolysis capacity announcements in the upcoming few years. And even if all those were realized, even only until the end of next year, we would increase electrolysis capacity in the EU by a factor of 10 from last year to the end of next year. So quite a staggering ramp up, really. And that is sounds interesting and sounds also encouraging. However, there is a bit of a pitfall to this, and that is that if we look at the exact same projects now, listed by project status, we see that most of them still lack a final investment decision. So the big blue chunk here, that is projects that are in a feasibility study stage, which means they have started their feasibility study. It doesn't even have to be finished yet. And only a small portion of projects are either already under construction or have a final investment decision in place. So really that big part here is inherently uncertain, which calls into question the reliability of all those announcements. Now, however, if we then look a bit further, not just to the end of next year, but to the end of this decade, to where we want to be, we see that the scale-up challenge ahead is quite staggering. We see that if we want to get to the EU target, which is 10 megatons of renewable hydrogen by 2030, which we translated into 100 gigawatts. Elisabeth used 140 gigawatts. It depends a bit on the assumptions that you make regarding the utilization rate. Maybe we are a bit optimistic. Maybe 140 gigawatts is a bit pessimistic regarding utilization. It's probably somewhere in between. However, the main point is that it's quite a scale-up that's required. So by the end of last year, we were at around 180 megawatts only, mostly in small-scale plants as well. And if we now say, well, the Repower EU target, the updated, is around 100 gigawatts, even that is already a scale-up of an increase of 550 within only 9 years. If you go to 140 gigawatts, it's even higher, obviously. Now, this is quite staggering. And if we then, however, assume that, well, we're seeing quite a bit of movement, as you see in the left two panels now in the market, but even if we assume that by the end of next year, around 30% of the uncertain projects will be built, so even though they haven't secured a final investment decision, let's make the assumption that a lot of those will be built, or a substantial amount of those. Even then, we still need a growth rate of around 100% nearly per year to achieve the Repower EU target. So really a doubling of capacity each year. And that doesn't only sound very high, that also is very high in comparison to other technologies, most notably to solar PV and wind, where we have seen historically growth rates around, well, maximum maybe 80% per year in any 7-year period during that boom phase. So really reaching the EU target requires unprecedented growth within the energy sphere. And even though PV and wind are already the growth rate champions of the energy transition so far. Now, this was just sort of like the introduction to outline or to give like an intuition on what our study was about. Now, in the actual paper, we did this, we translate this same intuition into a more statistically robust method. And what we did is then we also look a bit further than 2030, but further into the future. And what we do is we build a probabilistic technology diffusion model that is based on this kind of an S-shaped technology diffusion curve. So technologies typically penetrate new markets in that S-shaped curve, where in the beginning have an exponential growth that takes time until it kicks in. Then you have the growth phase, where growth is somewhat linear, and then it flattens out again towards the saturation phase in the end. Now, just to outline the challenges briefly again, also looking further into the future. So as I said, EU, we were around 180 megawatts last year, globally 600 megawatts. And if we look at where we want to be in the very long term, so in 2050, Elisabeth also mentioned the 500 gigawatts by 2050 in the EU. That's hidden in some footnote in the hydrogen strategy. Some scenarios also foresee larger electrolysis requirements. And globally, that number is from the IEA. That's 3.6 terawatts of electrolyzers that we need by 2050, according to the net zero emissions scenario of the IEA. Well, the point really then is, again, so electrolysis capacity needs to grow around 3,000-fold in the EU and even larger, around 6,000-fold globally within those 30 years to meet those targets. So really a staggering challenge again. So we now looked at what are plausible or feasible pathways over time in order to get there. And we did that by varying 3 uncertain parameters of that technology diffusion. The first parameter is what we call the initial capacity. Now, why is that uncertain? That is uncertain because we look a bit into the future, because we want to include a bit of the momentum that we saw building up in the upcoming years. But also we don't want to look too far into the future in order not to include any very uncertain, far away projects. And therefore, we take capacity data of 2023 as our initial year, so to say, in order to parameterize this model. Second one is that little triangle that you can see here is the emergence growth rate. That means the growth rate that is attained and in the exponential growth phase in the very beginning, when we are still relatively far away from the saturation phase. So meaning that saturation term hasn't really yet kicked in. So really the exponential growth that is realized in the very beginning. Now, what you then normally have in these technology diffusion pathways is a fixed final market volume. So essentially a technology penetrates into a market that is ready and that is there entirely, and just essentially takes time until it really takes over that entire market. Now, we argue that for green hydrogen, this is not exactly the case, because the hydrogen market is characterized by what's been called, by others, I should say, the three-sided chicken and egg problem. So the issue is that you don't only have to ramp up supply, which is what we're looking at here, but also simultaneously infrastructure and demand. So you also have to ramp up the hydrogen infrastructure, you have to secure demand, and that is quite different from what we saw in the case of solar PV, for example, where the infrastructure was already there, the electricity grid, demand for electricity was clearly there. All you essentially had to do is to plug in the solar panel and feed into the grid. Not quite as simple, but essentially infrastructure and demand were in place. And that is different in the hydrogen market, which is just evolving really. And what we therefore do is we change this fixed final market volume into a steadily increasing final market volume, or a demand pool, as we call it. And that is what we parameterize then by policy targets for the EU. We also include a bit of a parameter that includes anticipation of that demand pool. So, for example, investors anticipating that a certain amount of demand will be available by some time. Okay, so now, as I said, we parameterize this demand pool by policy targets. So that is 100 gigawatts in 2030 in the EU and 500 gigawatts in 2050. The initial capacity comes from the IEA hydrogen projects database that I just showed to you on the last slide. And for the emergence growth rate, and that's really the critical thing, is we distinguish between two different growth scenarios. The one being where we assume that electrolysis grows as fast as solar and wind have, and another one where we assume that electrolysis grows even faster in an emergency-like deployment scenario. And yeah, I can show you on the next few slides what technologies we use to parameterize that. Just briefly zooming into the main case, into the solar and wind case. So here we see the distribution of the uncertain parameters. So this is our capacity in 2023 and the likelihood or the probability density of that capacity. The horizontal colored bar that you see down there is essentially the bars that you saw earlier from 23 fallen over, so just turned 90 degrees. And so essentially we take a relatively broad distribution that is centered around, again, realizing 30% of the uncertain projects, but also extends even a tiny bit further beyond project announcements. For the growth rate, we, as this is the case where we compare to wind and solar, we parameterize by observed growth rates of wind and solar PV during their respective boom phases, which was between 1995 and 2010, I believe, is the time frame that we use. And there we parameterize then a broad distribution, again, that ranges from 15 to above 100% of growth per year. And what we then do in our model is we do a Monte Carlo simulation. So we draw a sample of 10,000, plug that into our model, and then aggregate all the numbers again. So really trying to get a sense of the uncertainties there. This is the main result, you could say. So this is the probabilistic feasibility space in the case of growth like solar and wind. Now what you're seeing is the shade of the graph here. So the red color indicates how likely it is that a certain amount of electrolysis capacity is reached at a certain point in time. And what we can see relatively clearly here is that we have, compared to where we want to be always, we have relatively little supply for around 15 years. So despite exponential growth, it just takes time until that really kicks into and translates into noticeable volumes of green hydrogen overall. What we then also see, however, is something like a breakthrough moment at some points around 2040. However, the exact timing is really uncertain. But around then, you see the probability mass sort of like tipping towards the upper end, and then more closely follows our demand pool. And around then, so around the breakthrough point, we also observe a fairly wide range of different electrolysis capacities. And that distribution is interestingly actually bimodal. So you see those two extrema here in the marginal plot. And that is because it is either more likely that either you have already tipped towards the upper end, or you're still at relatively low levels. But being right in between is relatively well, less likely. If we want to zoom in a bit into the part until 2030, we again also here clearly see, that's unsurprising from what we saw earlier, that the repower EU target of those 100 gigawatts is out of reach under growth rates like solar and wind. Now, because we don't want to be that pessimistic, and we also want to show what would be possible under very different circumstances, we also looked at an emergency deployment scenario, and we parameterized that by looking at really, really very different technologies.
You have 2 minutes more.
Yeah, that's fine. We look at really different technologies, ranging from World War II military equipment, nuclear weapons, nuclear power in France, also very, very modular technologies such as smartphones, e-bikes, internet hosts, all these kind of things. And we extract growth rates again, plug that back into the model. And what we then get is another feasibility space under this emergency deployment scenario. What we see here clearly is that we have a breakthrough around 2030 already, and this is also actually what's needed to reach the repower EU target. So it's now here clearly in the median of the entire ensemble of different pathways. We can also look briefly at the year of breakthrough, so at the time when when absolute deployment is highest per year. And unsurprisingly, emergency deployment accelerates that breakthrough to around 2030. On this part here, what's actually interesting, we can then also again check electrolysis capacity in these 2 years, so 2030 and 2040. Now, the interesting part here is that I translated this also into final energy shares. And what we see is that undergrowth like wind and solar, so that is as fast as what we've observed in the energy transition so far. Green hydrogen supply will supply less than 1% of final energy by 2030. So that is exactly this short-term scarcity. And by 2040 is just really uncertain. So there's really a lot of uncertainty then. Okay, wrapping up already. So, summarizing again, our first scenario, the solar and wind case, short-term scarcity, long-term uncertainty. That's really the key message here, which is particularly troubling due to that chicken and egg problem, because well, it just hampers the further development and investments into green hydrogen if supply isn't in place, because who is going to invest into infrastructure or demand-side transformation towards hydrogen then? Emergency deployment is really what's needed to overcome this short-term scarcity and to put the repower EU target within reach, and that is also required to reduce long-term uncertainty. Now, for policymakers, I would say that it's really a balancing act here. So it's a bit tricky because on the one hand, they really have to accelerate and coordinate this market ramp up because green hydrogen is inevitable in the longer run for some sectors. But on the other hand, despite going full throttle on green hydrogen, they still have to safeguard against the risk that hydrogen remains scarce for a while and potentially well into the 2030s. And simultaneously, nobody should forget direct electrification technologies either. So summing up, as Kermit might say, it's not easy being green, and neither is scaling up green hydrogen. And with that, I apologize for this terrible rhyme and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Adrian, for your interesting presentation.
I'll just stop sharing because otherwise I can't see anybody.
Okay, let's see if we have some questions from the audience.
If not, you can read it all up in the paper as well.
I will read the paper, of course. Well, I have a question. If you come back to slide number 6.
Yes. Okay.
So you have to share your screen again.
Yeah, I'll do that.
Yeah, unfortunately, we have time just for a question because we are a little delayed with the schedule.
Oops. This is where we want to be, right?
Yeah. Here I can see that in the two hypotheses, you assume the same, if I understand correctly, the same demand of hydrogen, that is the dot line. But according to the principle of the chicken egg problem you mentioned, I expected that the higher the penetration of hydrogen, and the higher should be also the demand of hydrogen. But I see that you assume the same level of demand in the case. So I was wondering if I understood it correctly, or if you make this assumption for simplify the simulation that of course makes sense, or if there is another reason behind this choice.
No, you're completely right. The only parameter that we changed between the left-hand side and the right-hand side here is really the growth rate distribution. We did that mostly to remain like a tractable system and to really be able to say what caused the difference. We have in the paper, think I don't have it on the slides here. We have a sensitivity analysis where we also increase the demand until the full range as well. So really until saying, well, it just penetrates into the market right away at full force. However, in the beginning, essentially, it doesn't make too much of a difference. So in the first, I would say 10 years or so, probably, the growth rate is really what constrains the market ramp up the most. So it's really that difference between looking at growth rate distributions. However, of course, you're right. I mean, in practice, it would also mean raising demands higher, and for that we've included in the sensitivity analysis. But I think so until 2030 at least, the main outcome isn't that different, simply because growth is still the main constraint there. But thanks for the question. Yeah.
Thank you for the answer. It's really clear. There is another interesting question from Tom Brown, but unfortunately we have to move on with the new speaker.
Oh no. Okay.
So the new speaker is Pedro Crespo de Granado. Pedro Crespo de Granado obtained his PhD at Lancaster University and is now associate professor at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. His research interest includes energy economics, power system, and energy transition. So he's going to present his research entitled Large-Scale Green Hydrogen Deployment in Europe, Environmental and Climate Impacts. So Pedro, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hope you'll hear us loud and clear. Good? Yes. So,
Yes.
yeah, great. Yeah, because I can see the full screen now. So yes, so this is a joint research with my colleagues and Hai-Ping Chen that's here.
Hello.
We will give the presentation together. Also Goran Durakovic and Raquel Santos George that are also cheering us on this effort presentation. So I will just jump in and look at what is our objectives here in this paper. So basically, a central hypothesis notion that was really well presented in the previous two presentations was about the scale up of green hydrogen with these targets, with these goals, with this amount of electrolyzers built up, and so on. So we think green hydrogen is going to be really attached to the power system. So we want to understand the impact of the power system. So, but also we want to understand how green hydrogen goes hand by hand with this wind and solar deployment. And by that meaning, how much wind and solar power surplus or is needed to deliver this amount of green hydrogen that, for example, for industry and transport are required. So the question we want to answer in this is how large will the green hydrogen deployment be given the climate targets for the European power sector, which is the 1.5 degrees. So we look for a 1.5 degree scenario. But also one thing that we felt it was not looked in too much and also part of the climate perspective is that what are the expected impacts of this large amount of electrolyzer or large amount of changing on end-use sector like industry and transport in terms of climate impacts or other environmental impacts. So we did it based on two methods, basically combining two methods. The first thing is very related to the earlier presentation of using a capacity expansion model like the PIPAPSA framework. We have our own model of that looks at the capacity expansion of the European power system, which is basically looking at the capacity expansion towards 2050. We use this multi-horizon stochastic programming model that has short-term representation, hourly short-term representation of each country with the stochastic scenarios in a short term, and also the capacity expansion every 5 years. And we have all the European countries, investments, and interconnections between countries and capacity exchange. So it's a capacity expansion model. And the second method relates to the environmental impacts and climate assessment. And for that, we basically perform an LCA and also perform 4 scenarios that I will go into details quickly about these environmental impacts. Will relate about business as usual, decarbonization with green hydrogen, decarbonization with blue hydrogen, decarbonization without green hydrogen, and so on. So what do I mean by these scenarios? Maybe I start with the baseline. So the baseline, there's basically, we assume that the end use sectors, industry and transport, they don't have a major shift, and they stay as this. They stay pretty much the same, and then they don't use any hydrogen or any other technologies to really abide to a transformation. So basically, the energy mix is hard to abate sectors. There's no major changes on it, and the material resource is still the same or with really little change. Then we have the next scenario, which we say that the green hydrogen really picks up, and then industry and transport, they use part of it for their own demand. So green hydrogen demand replace part of these hard to abate sectors. Not, of course, entirely, but it does to some degree, or plays a role to some degree. And also renewable plays a degree on that because we use green hydrogen, and this good infrastructure and support and distribution and usage for the electrolysis part. Then we have scenario 2, where we have the blue hydrogen playing a role. And we did it just to look at to compare a little bit. So basically, natural gas is used for this end use sector, industry and transport, and we look at basically the effect of hydrogen production, so steaming from methane reformation, and the life cycle analysis of this on these end use sectors. And the last one is basically decarbonization without hydrogen too much. So basically relying in other alternatives, other clean energy alternatives like biofuel and synthetic fuel and renewable electricity, that basically a mix that sort of replace these ones and so on. So going a little bit, what are the system boundaries on that? Then you can see that here is a way that we can see that we look at all the chain to do LCA analysis and the climate analysis. So basically, we have the electricity supply production that will go for green hydrogen. We more or less the natural gas production that will go to blue hydrogen, and then we sort of look at all these processes and how these in the different scenarios will lead to a different carbon footprint for industry transport, but also different environmental impacts of the choice of the energy mix and so on. So going a little bit now to the results part. So first, one of the first questions we had, and that's sort of what initiated this whole environmental impact, climate impact linkage to our energy system model, capacity expansion model, was yes, okay, we need a lot of green hydrogen. Looks like and how much of this green hydrogen will come from the power system. So basically, we said let's run a case where we don't have hydrogen demand, which has been more or less the assumption we had maybe in the last, before the hydrogen hype was a lot in the last 2-3 years. And the most of our capacity in a 1.5 degree scenario will reach around 2.5 terawatts of generation capacity. A significant of that will come from wind and solar PV. But when we include the green hydrogen demand that is coming from industry and transport, we see that this capacity expansion model says that for this, that you need to increase the capacity, the overall of the power system by 50%. So basically, we're saying that green hydrogen is not going to be only a byproduct of the surplus, and it's not going to rely only on the surplus of the really good capacity expansion that is taking place in 1.5 degree, but it will result out of a massive intake needed to really pump out and push green hydrogen. So this 50% increase for us sort of drop the question, okay, if we have this amount of electrolyzers built up and more infrastructure built up, how much this impacts the climate in terms of water, in terms of other resource materials that will be needed to really double, to expand by 50% the capacity, so on. And these are some of the results we got on the electrolyzer capacity in the North Sea. Just to give you an idea, we also put an energy hub in the capacity of the North Sea and some results of the electrolyzer capacity. This is not European-wide, but this is just some of the results on this. So what we got here is basically hydrogen demand we consider, which is exogenously considered demand, is that we have 1,200 terawatts of transport demand of hydrogen and 284 terawatts of hydrogen. And this demand is heterogeneous, assumed from the European hydrogen backbone for this. And this translates into basically that we need green hydrogen around 2,230 terawatts of renewable energy increase by 2050, which is 51% more than the scenario without green hydrogen. And now we go to the climate results of this part. Yeah.
So the significant increased renewable electricity required by the green hydrogen demand based on the PEM will increase the life cycle climate change around 14 megaton CO2 equivalent. So this is a life cycle GHG emission of the European electricity mix in 2050 based on the result of our result from the modeling. And this is with green hydrogen, and this is without hydrogen, and the contribution with different energy technology. So will the increased life cycle climate change impact due to the dedicated renewable electricity production be compensated by the clean usage process of the green hydrogen compared with other energy? So let's take a look at the decarbonization option, the path in industry first. So scenario 1 and 2 is the green and blue hydrogen respectively. And in scenario 3, we assume in the CCS and the biomethane will be applied in the options. And in the transport sector, we can see this is a heavy road sector, and this is the aviation sector. And scenario 1, scenario 2, same, the green and blue. And in scenario 3, electricity and the biomass will be used in the heavy road sector. And electricity, biomass, and also syn fuel will be applied in the aviation in scenario 3. So in order to understand how the climate change impact of hydrogen production contribution from different sectors, we compared the green, blue, and the gray hydrogen production. And we can see the life cycle change impact of green here, the blue. This one. This is the green hydrogen. So it's much lower than the gray and blue. This is half blue. 94% lower and 82% lower. And also we can see the majority of climate change impact of green hydrogen is contributed by the electricity, the light blue one. And this is only 1/4 of the impacts of the natural gas supply, the yellow part. And we can see in the gray hydrogen production, the climate change impacts are mainly contributed by the process-related emission, the brownish 78%, and the natural gas supplied 22%. And also you can see the CCS process only decrease the climate change impact from the process emission. The natural gas supply remain the same. Okay. Then we take a look at the whole package. We just go through a bit faster. The transport, dispensing, and the storage, and totally avoid 140 megatons. And then we take a look at the other climate change and other environmental impacts of the hydrogen production. We can see climate change and resource use, energy carriers, and ozone depletion, acidification. Blue is much higher than green hydrogen. And however, the other
sorry, but there's not a lot of time.
land use, water scarcity, metals, and intensification. Green is higher than blue. And also the human toxicity, human health, ecotoxicity, green is also higher than blue. So we take a look at the comparison of climate change impacts of industry. This is, we can see green is the lowest one, and blue then is blue, then without green and no change. This is a transport result. We just go through a bit faster. Then this is the whole picture of industry and transport. And and does green hydrogen win, and how? This is a comparison of climate change impacts in different phases, production and usage. Okay, we go through a bit faster. Conclusion. Results indicate the need of large-scale generation of wind power solar to sustain the hydrogen economy. The capacity of the wind and solar will need to increase by around 50% in 2050. And this will increase life cycle climate change impact 14 megatons CO2 equivalent. And green hydrogen wins in life cycle climate change impact. However, green hydrogen has the drawbacks of the other environmental impacts, such as land use, water depletion, human health, human toxicity, and and ecotoxicity. And we acknowledge for the partner and the company for their support. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you guys for your presentation. Was it really interesting? Let's see if we have some questions from the audience. We do not have a lot of time because we still have one speaker more. So I have a question, if no question from the audience. I'm not sure if I understand if in your simulation you consider the possibility to import hydrogen outside Europe, and if so, how do you think this can impact the balance of the environmental impact of the utilization of hydrogen, if it does somehow?
So your question is how the hydrogen evolution, or sorry, I missed that.
If you consider the possibility to import hydrogen outside Europe for the European hydrogen demand, and if this impact the environmental impact for the utilization of hydrogen in the European energy system.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I think this will not affect the fundamental results that we are presenting, but will certainly something to mention, for example, in our conclusions and other points. But the fundamental issue remains that green hydrogen, of course, is much better than in many certain settings, but there's some drawbacks as well, and not only on demand and cost that have been the previous presentations, but also some other health, climate, environmental impacts.
Yes, other categories.
Totally agree. Yeah. So, okay, so if there's no question from the audience, there is a question. What's a standard used to define blue hydrogen? For example, low carbon hydrogen under the Renewable Energy Directive, 70% below a carbon-based equivalent as measured by LCA.
Yeah, the LCA is including the different phase, like the upstream supply, like blue hydrogen. Actually, the climate change impact contributions most from the natural gas supply. So, and it's 4 times than the renewable electricity production supply to the green hydrogen. So we calculate the whole phase of the, compare with the same demand, based on the same demand, then we calculate the whole life cycle impacts.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for your presentation. It's really interesting open discussion, of course. So I will now have to introduce the final speaker, Feiko Ukert. Feiko Ukert is a senior researcher at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. He did his PhD on renewable system integration. He also has a background in physics and economics, and now he's conducting research in the field of climate change mitigation and energy system transformation. His research is entitled on the competitiveness of blue and green hydrogen. So Falco, please, you can start your presentation. I will tell you when you will have 2 minutes more for your presentation.
Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me well. Yeah, this is the last presentation, and I find it's creating a broad and complementing picture our different presentations. I zoom into a study where we look at the specific cost competitiveness of blue and green hydrogen. We don't do modeling. We don't show scenarios. And also, we do not specifically look at a region and specify all parameters depending on a region. But we have a framework which can do this, and I give some implications on regional conclusions as well, as you will see. At the core, there's really the question: what is the role of blue hydrogen? How does it compete to green hydrogen? And then also I touch a bit upon the competitiveness of hydrogen versus fossil fuels, mostly natural gas, I take as a reference. And in there is, of course, the question, what did the war in Ukraine and the high natural gas prices in the EU change there? And everything that I show is also based on life cycle emissions, so scope 1 till 3 for both blue and green hydrogen. As the results are very sensitive to parameter assumptions, we have developed an interactive tool that we will publish along with the paper as soon as it's accepted. Right now, we only have a working paper. Actually, the link to the tool is already there, but we refine it still. And feedback is very welcome. So let's jump into it. What we do in general is we combine costs and LCA emissions of blue and green hydrogen. On the left side, you see our cost assumptions. We define different cases for both blue and green hydrogen and for natural gas costs that you can see here. We're trying to reflect the heterogeneity that comes with the different regions, but also the uncertainty, especially with respect to the timing of the reduction of green hydrogen costs. In general, what we can see from the ranges in the literature, the point of cost parity of blue and green hydrogen is uncertain. It depends also on the region, but in general, there's no clear picture where green hydrogen becomes cheaper than blue hydrogen in the short to mid term. That is why we have to include the emissions, because there is a clear picture that the emissions of the green hydrogen, at least when it's run with dedicated renewables, with 100% renewables, become lower than those of blue hydrogen, irrespective of the specific choice of blue hydrogen production. Maybe I zoom in a little bit more. So maybe on the right side, you can see that we specify one case for green hydrogen where 25% of the electricity that goes in is coming from the grid and the rest is renewable electricity. So it substantially increases the LCA emissions in the long term. Then all our cases have lower emissions. The blue one down here is a clean blue hydrogen based on ATR, on autothermal reforming, where 93% of the CO2 can be captured. The shaded line indicates that the results on LCA emissions very much depend on the global warming potential that we assume. As a default, we take the global warming potential of with a 100-year time horizon, but this is GWP20 for this sensitivity that you can see here. So even especially with the clean blue hydrogen, it very much depends on the time horizon in the GWP metric that you assume. This is the SMR hydrogen, where you only capture hydrogen at one point in the process, where you get out 50 to 60% of the CO2. So this is the standard process of producing blue hydrogen, the established one. I add some light on specific uncertainties with a different picture that we already published. I just want to stress maybe three things. The first thing is the green costs that you can see here are costs of green hydrogen in the EU, and they're grid connected, so they cannot bypass the high electricity price in the EU in the currently very tense situation in the system that is also anticipated to maintain until 2030. And in general, this seems to be the case, or it's a general question: can green hydrogen production in the EU, can this 100 gigawatt or 140 gigawatt target in the EU, can that be produced based on low wind and solar LCOE, or does it have to somehow price in the high electricity price, so the scarcity of electricity, specifically the scarcity of renewable electricity? We anticipate that the answer to the last question was the latter. So yes, it has to pay for the scarcity. It has to pay high electricity costs, and this is what we parameterize in our conservative case that is can be interpreted as a grid-connected case. The second point that I want to highlight is it very much depends on regulation, whether you pay grid electricity fees or not. And the third point is it depends on potential costs of imported hydrogen. And there we see a huge uncertainty. These are these ranges. The brown one is pipeline import from MENA, but also across EU, the brown corridor, different literature here. and the blue one is shipping import, which are higher typically, but also we see a broad range, just to see the uncertainty that we have there. What else? In general, we always have conservative and progressive cases. For blue hydrogen, a key number is the capture rate. I mentioned the two, but also the methane leakage rate. For the conservative case, we have the global average, which is 1.5% of methane leakage compared to the natural gas extracted. For the progressive case, we go down to 0.1%, which some experts don't deem likely or plausible. At the same time, we have best practice examples like the extraction in Norway, which already reach such low values. What else? Maybe for the green hydrogen electrolysis capex, we go down to 110 in the long term in the progressive case, and we hover at 300 in the conservative case. And last but not least, natural gas prices. Here we have, for the low scenario, we have 15 euro per megawatt hour. That's corresponding to future prices in the US. So from about 2025, the futures say this. And the high prices, natural gas prices, they are consistent with the future prices that we see with the indices around Europe. So the TTF natural gas index, for example, which is saying that we have a maintained increase of 60 euro per megawatt hour in 2025, and then hovering at around 40 from 2030. High uncertainty with those parameters as well, of course. But this is why we make a broad span. So we combine costs and emissions into cost competitiveness to basically see what happens if we price in the emissions, the different emissions. What changes to the cost competitiveness? How is this cost parity? So the direct cost parity picture is altered if we have CO2 pricing. And the basic metric we use is fuel switching CO2 prices. That is the CO2 price needed to make one dirtier option equal in costs with the more expensive clean option. Simple picture on that, still schematic. Costs are on the y-axis, CO2 prices on the x-axis, and we see that we have three options: green, blue hydrogen, and natural gas, and where they intersect, a fuel switching price, CO2 price, is defined. And typically the order is that the blue to fossil CO2 price, fuel switching CO2 price comes first. Then we have the green to fossil fuel switching CO2 price, where green hydrogen and natural gas in this case are on par, reach cost parity. And then if you need to squeeze out more emissions from your system, you have a blue to green switching price, very high CO2 price in the beginning, where the total cost of green hydrogen fall below those of blue hydrogen. But the interesting thing is that this picture changes in time as green hydrogen, for instance, which is the biggest driver, gets reduced costs, so costs decrease, so the green line goes down, and this triangle inverts, and suddenly you have a fuel switching price of blue to green that comes first, then the fuel switching price of green replacing natural gas, and then blue hydrogen gets the highest fuel switching CO2 price. And when you're in such a situation, it's obvious that basically blue hydrogen leaves your marginal abatement cost curves. It's not a cost competitive mitigation option anymore. And the question is, when does this switching happen in time? Another schematic picture. How many minutes do I have? I feel like I wasted a bit of time.
3.5.
3.5?
Yes.
Okay, good. So translating this picture into time, now we see how for instance, the green fuel switching CO2 price decreases due to decreasing costs of green hydrogen, and at the same time also blue hydrogen has some innovations in terms of first cost reduction, but also then blue hydrogen can or gets cleaner, for instance, by reducing methane leakage. So they all reduce in time. There's an interesting point where they all overlap. That's the point where this triangle inverts. And now you can mark 5 fuel switching points in this process. And the fifth one is that the one we look usually at, and this is the point of cost parity, so really direct cost. But this mostly comes last. So it's really interesting to look at what happens before. There's this point of intersection where green hydrogen becomes the cheapest mitigation option, irrespective of CO2 pricing. At the same time as costs are still higher than blue hydrogen, you need a CO2 price to unmask this property. And then with the CO2 price, you can introduce 3 other fuel switching CO2 prices. So this is a rising CO2 price in time now. First, you have a phase where hydrogen is not competitive based on CO2 prices only, so it wouldn't need additional complementary policies. But then with a rising CO2 price, typically blue hydrogen becomes competitive first, then green hydrogen becomes competitive, and then this point is reached that I described before, where we squeeze out more emissions from the system, and blue becomes less cost competitive. And now we are looking at these 5 points with specific data. And the interesting question is, when do we have this transition towards more cost competitiveness of green hydrogen? And how small is the blue hydrogen competitiveness window? Because what you can see here is, in the beginning, hydrogen is not at all competitive, so it needs some CO2 pricing or complementary measures. But then at the same time, as green gets cheaper, the window of competitiveness closes, and this is connected with investment uncertainty. So as an investor, you don't know how long you actually have a business case if you compete with ever cheaper green hydrogen. So now with real parameterization, we have 4 scenarios. I go through them quickly as time is running out. We have a high gas price scenario, a low gas price, and conservative cost assumptions and progressive assumptions. And really, really quickly, for the high gas and the conservative, just SMR, dirty blue hydrogen obviously doesn't have a chance. Green is the cheaper mitigation options right from the start. However, it requires some CO2 pricing to unmask this behavior. The second one is, with a high gas price now, still the dirty blue hydrogen is not an efficient mitigation option. At the same time, you need a much higher CO2 price, with our trajectory only reached in 2040 to unmask this behavior here. And at the same time, also the competitiveness with natural gas, with low natural gas prices of hydrogen, becomes very challenging. Now, if green and blue hydrogen become cheap, and blue hydrogen is based on ATR, with high gas prices still, the case for ATR is challenging. So if you have really cheap hydrogen, it's likely more competitive, at least based on our main parameterization. At the same time, this is very sensitive to assumptions. And finally, and here we have the real competition. If you have both, if you have progressive assumptions for instance, very clean blue hydrogen and cheap green hydrogen, and at the same time a low gas price, which is a prerequisite, then you might have a longer coexistence of blue and green hydrogen, and you have these going through the fuel switching CO2 prices only after 2035. And this is the case that is more likely for the US, a coexistence and some competitiveness in the mid to long term. And this on the left side is rather the case for the EU, where blue hydrogen, the blue hydrogen window might have closed already, I would say. But then, and these are my last remarks, it very much depends on the scarcity of green hydrogen and on whether you need a backup when switching to a hydrogen application. And this is my open question maybe to the more detailed modelers. How do you ramp up green hydrogen economy and hydrogen applications only based on green hydrogen? Can we fill early infrastructure only based on green hydrogen, and can we switch to, for instance, green ammonia only based on the fluctuating input of electrolysis? Or is it that local storage is too expensive and that actually some gray or blue hydrogen would be beneficial and green and blue hydrogen wouldn't compete but complement each other? Thanks for your attention. I have some more conclusions that I share with the slides that you can look at later.
Thank you, Paco, for your interesting presentation and interesting research. Let's see if there's any question from the audience. Yeah, there's a question. How much of the story is affected by the high transport cost of hydrogen? Would it look different for blue-green ammonia produced on site? Interesting question.
I mean, the transport and storage costs, they and also the distribution costs, they can be substantial. So it very much depends on the specific supply chain that you're having. With ammonia, we have the luck somehow that we have existing infrastructure, and then that we can bypass much of these costs. How would that translate into blue versus green competitiveness? Well, you would bypass those costs for both blue and green, and so far I harmonized the costs. So that means that the competitiveness would look similar. At the same time, and this is important, the EU, in the EU, green ammonia from so the gray ammonia actually or the green ammonia is competing with blue ammonia imports from, for instance, the US. So blue ammonia can be a way of exporting cheap natural gas to the EU. So this is a very interesting case, and there is substantial reason for assuming that there is at least a blue ammonia bridge in the EU. But this again, this very much depends also on short-term regulation. The funding, the subsidies that I know are focused on green ammonia imports right now, such that the competitiveness of blue hydrogen or blue ammonia is then questioned.
Okay, so we have less than 2 minutes for concluding, so I think there is no time for any question more. So I would like to thank a lot all the speakers and thank all of the audience for participating in this interesting session. I hope you found it useful as it is. And I think there is still a lot of question that remains open about the role of hydrogen in Europe. And we will see how this research is going to go. And so thank you, all of you again. And I hope you're going to enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you very much, Gabriele. If I may simply say, yes, you can continue your questions, conversations in the virtual rooms that will be open at 16. We will take a quick coffee break, but we're trying to accommodate the virtual constraints, and we've created 4 different poster rooms with 23 different posters and hopefully the presenters. And so yes, I highly recommend you to head over there after some coffee. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eduardo. Thank you to all.